Hey everybody, I'm Christopher Green. You're tuning into AMTV Alternative Media Television. It is, of course, Monday, July 14, 2014, and this is an extremely perilous time for the United States and the global economy at large. With a recent report coming out over the weekend from The Telegraph and other mainstream media sources, the BIS chief that oversees central banks around the world, including the Federal Reserve, the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, fears that a fresh Lehman collapse may be approaching from worldwide surge in debt. Jamie Caruna says investors are ignoring prospects of higher interest rates in the not too distant future in the hunt for short-term returns. Now, it's amazing to me that mainstream officials, politicians, bankers in Washington, D.C., pundits and commentators on CNBC don't think that there will be consequences for trillions of dollars spent in bank bailouts and in stimulus programs, government orchestrated, manufactured programs like quantitative easing to infinity, and 0% interest rates won't result in an even worse crash in the not too distant future. Again, the lesson learned in 2008 that more and more debt and loose lending standards will only give us more future problems. And again, compounding the situation with more and more debt is idiotic and asinine at best. Here the article says that the world economy is just as vulnerable to a financial crisis as it was in 2007, with the added danger that debt ratios are now far higher and emerging markets have been drawn into the fire as well, the Bank for International Settlements has warned. Jamie Caruna, head of the Swiss-based financial watchdog, said investors were ignoring the risk of monetary tightening in their voracious hunt for yield. Quoted, markets seem to be considering only a very narrow spectrum of potential outcomes. They have become convinced that monetary conditions will remain easy for a very long time and may be taking more assurance that central banks wish to give. Now, the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, also predicted and gave dire warnings ahead of the collapse of Lehman Brothers and pre-collapse 2008, which brought down the entire global financial system. Remember, whether or not you believe this to be manufactured by the global elite as the reason for a wealth transfer, as many people do, it's more of a conspiratorial take, or you believe that the bankers just mismanaged their balance sheets. They were the ones that told us it would be the end of the world in 2008 unless the American people and people around the world spent trillions of dollars in the largest bailouts in the history of the world. And now debt ratios are even higher than they were before. I want you to think about that. The debt ratios are even higher than they were before in 2007, pre-crash, when the world was about to come to an end. According to the bankers, not me. According to Jamie Dimon, according to Lloyd Blankfein, according to the banks. Mr. Caruna said the international system is in many ways more fragile than it was in the build-up to the Lehman crisis. Debt ratios in the developed economies have risen by 20 percentage points to 275% of GDP since then. While in the meantime, credit spreads have also fallen to wafer-thin levels. Companies are borrowing heavily to buy back their own shares. It's one of the reasons stock prices have been pushed higher, as well as easy credit and aggressive borrowing by hedge funds and institutional investors at the Federal Reserve borrowing window. The BIS said 40% of syndicated loans are to sub-investment grade borrowers. So not only has the debt ratio here in the United States risen a solid full 20 percentage points to 275% of GDP, worse than what we had in 2007, pre the worst calamity in the history of the world, when the bankers told the American people that the world was going to come to an end unless you and I spent trillions of dollars mortgaging our children and children's children and children's children's future into infinity. Not only are credit spreads at wafer-thin levels, but the BIS says that 40% of syndicated loans are to sub-investment grade borrowers, meaning they're lending money again to those borrowers that shouldn't be getting it. Again, fueling the fire, the equivalent of pouring gasoline on a fire and pushing and building this debt load even higher and higher into the future. Again, the ratio higher than it was in 2007 with ever fewer protection covenants for creditors. You can see here a chart of syndicated lending, and you can see here leverage versus investment grade in red, leverage borrowing in blue, and you can compare it to 2007. You can see how we began to delever in '08, but now we've just been levering up again. The central banks around the world, especially here the Federal Reserve in the United States, not learning a single lesson about the past just a few years ago, now lending great portions of total debt to below investment grade and leveraged borrowers. The disturbing twist in this cycle is that China, Brazil, Turkey, and other emerging economies have succumbed to private credit booms all on their own, partly as a spillover from the quantitative easing in the West. I can verify this with one of my close friends actually living in Brazil. In fact, he left the country during the height of the crisis, and he's been telling me for years now that Brazil is really experiencing almost a renaissance in real estate, property values, and really credit expansion, similar to what we've experienced in past years in the United States. So not only is the United States more levered than it was before, but China, Brazil, Turkey, and other emerging economies also in their own booms. Their debt ratios have risen 20 percentage points as well to 175%. Average borrowing rates for 5 years is 1% in real terms. Again, showing you the wafer-thin credit spreads that not only has credit risen exponentially since 2008, but average borrowing rates are virtually at zero. Incredible. This is extremely low and, of course, could reverse suddenly. We are watching this closely, according to the BIS. If we were concerned by excessive leverage in 2007, we cannot be more relaxed today. And again, the question here, folks, and here we're seeing a chart of U.S. equity volatility, is how is the Fed able to exit from this historic stimulus? How is Janet Yellen and the Federal Reserve and global central banks at large able to exit from this historic stimulus? 0% interest rates and this trillions of dollars worth of new debt? And the answer to that question, I believe, is that they can't effectively. They'll do it too slowly. And that will result, with what we're experiencing now, even larger, more aggressive, and violent asset bubbles that we're seeing across asset classes in the United States and abroad than we've ever seen before. And of course, we will all have to pay the piper in the not too distant future. Well, the people will, not the bankers. They get bailouts after they crash financial markets. But you and I and our children will pay for those consequences in the not too distant future. And personally, this is of my personal opinion, I think that the bubbles will get much, much larger than they currently are, and that we are going to see runaway inflation, if not hyperinflation, as a major risk and a major player in the coming years. I think we're experiencing this right now before the bubble eventually pops and could get largely out of control, bigger than what we saw, and is arguably already bigger than what we saw in 2007, because again, the Federal Reserve will not be able to exit in time, and this will drive asset prices up very, very aggressively and will virtually bankrupt real wealth here in the United States of America and abroad. It's one of the reasons why you want to own real assets. Here we have another corroborating report from RT. BIS chief warns debt mountain puts global economy into worse state than before the 2008 crash. The BIS, the Bank of International Settlements that oversees the Federal Reserve and central banks around the world, warning the American people and people around the world that the debt mountain, because it is much larger than it was before, puts the global economy in a worse state than before the 2008 crash. We saw last week Portugal and one of their very large banks is defaulting on some of their debt, echoes of what we experienced pre the Lehman era, before all the major financial institutions in the U.S. and abroad went to zero and then had to be bailed out in the trillions of dollars by the American people and people around the world. Of course, we didn't get any riots here in the United States. We saw some in Greece, but Americans here in the United States just thought it was, I guess, okay and cool of the American people to donate, really just robbed trillions of dollars from American taxpayers to billionaires here that caused the collapse in the first place. Again, all this reported by The Telegraph, mainstream outlets, RT, among others. Now, while this is happening and they're blowing up even more aggressive bubbles, and the BIS is warning of a debt mountain that puts the global economy into a worse state than before the 2008 crash, sales of Rolls-Royces and Bentleys are hitting record highs with double-digit growth year over year. In fact, there are so many billionaires and millionaires now as a result of this engineered wealth transfer of wealth from the middle class to the same elitists, most of them bankers, that caused the collapse in the first place. Again, this was all intended to put more money into their pockets. That luxury car makers like Rolls-Royce and Bentley are having to decrease their supply of vehicles because they're selling too many. The demand is just simply too high. Whether or not it's the Rolls-Royce Phantom, it's many of the Bentley offshoots, these cars ranging from $200,000, $300,000 to $500,000 with luxury options like chillers for champagne and humidors for cigars and lipstick matched interiors, are having to shut down supplies because the demand is simply too high by billionaires and newly minted millionaires, largely responsible for this asset transfer in the first place. You can read about the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, here at their website, www.bis.org. It gives you a little information about what they do, established in the 17th of May in 1930. Right around that time, we had the 1929 financial crash and 10-year-long Great Depression, followed by World War II. It's one of the world's oldest international financial organizations. You can read up on it here and read about how it oversees central banks around the world. Again, warning of another crash, but this time worse than what we experienced in 2008. Also pulled a bailout list just to refresh your memory of all the major banking and financial institutions here in the United States that accepted trillions of dollars, really rather just extorted trillions of dollars. Again, the equivalent of a thief or a robber walking into your home with a gun and just stealing assets from your family, just robbing your house and taking out your refrigerator and anything else of value so that they can pad their own pockets. Just to remind the American people and the people around the world, you tuning in, just how much was dispersed and spent in bailouts as a result of the 2008 financial crash. You can only imagine how much larger these bailouts will be in the future with the next crash. With Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac still largely unregulated today, still lending egregiously at 3.5% down with those programs, so there's virtually no skin in the game for borrowers. Again, they've got to make sure there's no skin in the game, otherwise the whole economy crashes because they wouldn't be able to lend to anybody because everyone's broke except for the people buying Bentleys now. But here we have the total disbursements, $116 billion going to Fannie Mae in the 2008 era. Freddie Mac, $71 billion, AIG, $67 billion, General Motors, $50 billion, Bank of America, $45 billion, Citigroup, $45 billion, JP Morgan Chase, $25 billion, Wells Fargo, $25 billion, GMAC, $16 billion, Goldman Sachs, $10 billion, Morgan Stanley, $10 billion. Of course, other companies like Merrill Lynch being swallowed by Ken Lewis's Bank of America, all these mergers and acquisitions during the bailout era. Companies like American Express, Warren Buffett's company. In fact, Warren Buffett's company is receiving more than $100 billion during the 2008 financial crash to support his investments, to make sure they didn't go down to zero. Of course, all these billionaires get special treatments, so they never have to take a loss. Only you do. But it's okay, because I'll hear these bankers actually tell me this. It's okay because they paid it back. After they stole money from you and your household, and they robbed it from you and your children, so now that we might be in an inflationary or hyperinflationary collapse, they paid it back after they robbed you. It's the equivalent of the mob putting a gun to your face and telling you that they're going to kill you unless they can steal from you. And after they steal your money, they pay you back and say, well, it's okay because I stole from you and now I paid you back with a little bit of a profit. See the psychology behind these scumbags? People like John Corzine, who robbed his account holders an estimated $1.6 billion during the financial crash of his firm MF Global, an estimated $1.6 billion with a B, took money right out of his customer accounts to pay for losses in his bets, his bad bets in derivatives during the fallout of his firm MF Global. People like John Corzine not even getting a slap on the wrist, walking scot-free after stealing $1.6 billion. Here's an article. Here's why there will be no criminal charges in the MF Global case. Again, if you and I did this, if you stepped into a liquor store with a gun and stole $20, you might go to jail for life if you had 3 strikes. But MF Global star and king here, John Corzine, who also has donated millions to the Obama campaign, one of the reasons why he hasn't been charged, stole $1.6 billion from his own customer client accounts during the crash of his firm MF Global. The money just went missing. And this guy walks scot-free and is now starting a new hedge fund. Isn't that hilarious? It just goes to show you and just encourages our youth. Become a banking criminal. Make millions, billions, steal billions, extort billions through financial bailouts and get away with it. In fact, that's the new American dream. Steal from the American people and be complimented so you can go out and buy your Bentley or your new Rolls-Royce Phantom. That's the world that we live in today. While in the meantime, low-level criminals, I would argue, like Mr. Mayor Ray Nagin, who was very much a figure and a face of the Hurricane Katrina era during the Hurricane Katrina disaster in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit, goes to jail for 10 years in federal Palmy-in-the-ass prison for what I would consider low-level bribery. John Corzine steals $1.6 billion, gets to start a new hedge fund, donates more money to the Obama campaign, Obama's second campaign, walks scot-free, and Nagin here, who received an estimated $500,000, a measly 500,000 buckaroos, compared to $1.6 billion in a what I would consider a low-level bribery crime and money laundering crime, goes to jail for 10 years. Just goes to show you the double standard. When you're high enough up on the totem pole of Washington, D.C. and Wall Street, you can do anything you want. There are no rules for you because you're one of the cohorts of the Obama administration or whatever political power is in Washington, D.C. at the time. Again, this revolving door of politician and elite banker who literally, again, I'm not making this stuff up, steals money from his own customer accounts. I mean, it doesn't get any more dirty than this. It doesn't get any more sinister and downright evil than it does this scumbag here you're looking at, John Corzine, stealing $1.6 billion. Doesn't do jail time, starts a new hedge fund. He's drinking Chardonnay and whatever else he does on a regular basis, driving around in his Rolls Royce. While Ray Nagin here, who I could argue has done more for humanity, uniting the good, struggling people of New Orleans during the Hurricane Katrina crisis in 2005, gets 10 years for low-level bribery. Again, none of it makes sense, my friends. The BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, oversees all central banks around the world, predicting another crash worse than what we experienced in 2008. And the precursors that made up Lehman, the warning signs and the red lights going off before the last crash, now telling us that an even worse crash is coming. And we have to ask the question, what happens next? What will the result be, and what will the consequences be of this next great crash? How will the Federal Reserve react with more bailouts when they've already spent all the money on bailouts and they can't take interest rates any lower because they're already at zero? And Europe and the United States largely contracting in terms of its GDP growth, as we saw in recent reports here in the United States. So we have no growth, 0% interest rates, and the asset bubbles are even bigger than they were before. Again, giving Federal Reserve and the monetary policies and quantitative easing, etc., little or no room to hide in the not too distant future. And we can only imagine how bad things could potentially get. While you and me suffer on the streets like this lovely lady did in the 1930s, these billionaires that have extorted and stolen trillions from you and I decide between two options, Rolls-Royce or Bentley. I'm Christopher Green. Get it out everywhere, make it viral, hard-hitting it in your face, and click the link below to support our sponsor.